Sure, let's break it down step by step. Who was Surendranath Banerjee? 1. Early career. Surendranath Banerjee was a civil servant who started working for the British government in India in 1869. 2. Dismissal. In 1874, he was fired from his job for unclear reasons. This was a big setback for him. 3. Shift to public life. After losing his job, he decided to focus on public work instead of his career in the civil service. India's situation in the 1870s. 1. British rule. Before 1858, different parts of India were ruled by various local kings and the East India Company. But in 1858, India came under direct control of the British Crown. 2. Communication issues. Before the 1870s, it was hard for people in different parts of India to communicate with each other because travel and communication were slow. 3. Railways. In the 1870s and 1880s, the British built many railways in India. This made travel and communication much faster, connecting different parts of the country. Banerjee's public life. 1. First steps. After his career in the civil service ended, Banerjee began speaking publicly in Kolkata, now Calcutta. 2. Temperance movement. He gave a speech to promote the idea of drinking less alcohol, which got people's attention. 3. Education. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, a famous educator, made Banerjee a professor of English at a school called the Metropolitan Institution. 4. Oratory skills. Banerjee was very good at speaking and started to be invited to speak at many places, especially to students. 5. Patriotism. He taught people about Giuseppe Mazzini, an Italian leader who wanted to unite Italy. Banerjee used stories from both Indian and foreign history to inspire pride and patriotism among Indians. Banerjee's political views. 1. Moderate approach. Banerjee was part of a group called Moderates. They wanted changes and improvements but did not seek full independence from British rule. 2. Demands. They wanted more Indian representation in the government and better roles in decision-making, but they did not demand full independence at that time. Extra information. 1. Historical context. During Banerjee's time, many Indians wanted to be more involved in the decisions affecting their country, but were still loyal to the British Crown. 2. Impact. Banerjee is remembered as one of the first leaders to work on a national level in India and to use his influence to inspire and educate people. Example. Imagine a student who, after being removed from their school, starts giving public speeches and teaching others about history and patriotism. This student then becomes a well-known figure for promoting pride and advocating for better representation in student councils. Does that help clarify things? Let's break this down simply. Forming the Indian Association. 1. Banerjee's plan. Surendranath Banerjee wanted to create a group that could unite Indians for political goals. 2. Indian Association. On July 26, 1876, he and Ananda Mohan Bose started the Indian Association in Kolkata. 3. Inspiration. Banerjee was inspired by Giuseppe Mazzini, who united Italy. He wanted to bring Indians together with shared political goals. Civil services issue. 1. British policy change. The British government decided to lower the maximum age for Indians to take the Indian Civil Service (ICS) exam from 21 to 19 years. 2. Banerjee's reaction. Banerjee saw this as a trick by the British to make it harder for Indians to join the civil service, which was a powerful position. 3. Public protest. Banerjee organized a large public meeting on March 24, 1877 in Town Hall, Kolkata. This meeting was special because it aimed to unite all of India to speak against this change. 4. New strategy. At the meeting, people decided to come together not only for the civil service issue, but also to speak out about other British policies affecting Indians. Banerjee's historic railway tour. 1. First to use railways for politics. On May 26, 1877, Banerjee became the first Indian leader to travel by train across India to spread political awareness. 2. Railway network. By the mid-1870s, India had over 6,500 miles, 10,430 kilometers of railways, which made it easier to travel between cities. 3. Cities visited. Banerjee visited many important cities like Lahore, Amritsar, Delhi, Kanpur, and Lucknow. 4. Meetings and associations. In every city, he organized large meetings to protest the civil services policy. He also set up new branches of the Indian Association to unite people across India. Impact of Banerjee's tour. 1. Unifying India. Through his tours, Banerjee connected different parts of India. He worked to unite political movements and aspirations across the country. 2. Laying the groundwork for the Indian National Congress. His efforts helped prepare the way for the creation of the Indian National Congress, which was formed in December 1885. Example. Imagine a teacher traveling to different schools in many cities, speaking to students about how important it is to fight for their rights. This teacher also sets up student groups in each school to work together. Over time, these student groups come together to create a big organization to speak out for all students. Banerjee's work helped unite India and gave rise to a movement that would eventually lead to India's independence. That makes sense? Would you like to know more details about any part? Let's break this information down in the simplest way. First National Conference, 1883. 1. Organized by Indian Association. In 1883, the Indian Association, which Surendranath Banerjee co-founded, held the first national conference in Kolkata from December 28 to 30th. 2. Leader of the conference. The conference was led by Ramtanu Lahiri, a respected figure from the Bengal Renaissance, a movement that brought social and cultural reform to Bengal. 3. Topics discussed. Representative councils, or self-government. The idea that Indians should have more say in how they are governed. Education. They talked about improving both general and technical education for Indians. Judicial and executive functions. They wanted to separate the powers of the courts, judicial, and the government, executive, to make the justice system fairer. Jobs for Indians. They discussed how to get more Indians employed in public service jobs under British rule. Banerjee's continued efforts in 1884. 1. Another tour. In May 1884, Banerjee traveled again across northern India, especially between Kolkata and Lahore, to keep pushing the issue of civil service reform. 2. Petitions. He gathered petitions asking the British Secretary of State to raise the age limit for Indians to take the civil services exam. 3. Result. In 1885, a public service commission recommended raising the maximum age limit, which was a small victory for Banerjee and his cause. Second National Conference, 1885. Clash of dates. The Second National Conference of the Indian Association was held in Kolkata between December 25 to 27, 1885. 2. Indian National Congress, INC, is formed. At the same time, the first session of the Indian National Congress, INC, was being held in Bombay, now Mumbai. 3. No coordination. These two important events were not planned together, so Banerjee could not attend the Bombay Congress. 4. Similar issues. The topics discussed at the Bombay Congress were very similar to those discussed at the First National Conference in 1883. In fact, Justice K.T. Telang, who was part of the Bombay Congress, even asked Banerjee for notes from the First National Conference. Banerjee's involvement with Congress. 1. Regular attendance. From 1886 to 1917, Banerjee attended every annual session of the Indian National Congress, except the one in Karachi in 1913. 2. Leadership. Banerjee was chosen to lead the Congress twice, once in Pune, 1895, and again in Ahmedabad, 1902. Simplified example. Imagine a group come together to discuss how to improve their school, like adding new clubs, separating teachers from school management decisions, and giving students more opportunities for jobs. They meet every year to talk about these issues. Then a bigger student group, like a National Student Council, is formed, and it talks about the same ideas that the first group had already discussed. One of the key leaders of the first group continues to attend and lead the meetings of the bigger group, making sure the same issues are addressed. In this story, Banerjee is the student who starts the first group, and later he becomes a key figure in the bigger national group, Indian National Congress. Does that help explain it? Would you like to know more about any part? Let's break this information down in the simplest way. First National Conference, 1883. 1. Organized by Indian Association. In 1883, the Indian Association, which Surendranath Banerjee co-founded, held the first national conference in Kolkata from December 28 to 30th. 2. Leader of the conference. The conference was led by Ramtanu Lahiri, a respected figure from the Bengal Renaissance, a movement that brought social and cultural reform to Bengal. 3. Topics discussed. Representative councils, or self-government. The idea that Indians should have more say in how they are governed. Education. They talked about improving both general and technical education for Indians. Judicial and executive functions. They wanted to separate the powers of the courts, judicial, and the government, executive, to make the justice system fairer. Jobs for Indians. They discussed how to get more Indians employed in public service jobs under British rule. Banerjee's continued efforts in 1884. 1. Another tour. In May 1884, Banerjee traveled again across northern India, especially between Kolkata and Lahore, to keep pushing the issue of civil service reform. 2. Petitions. He gathered petitions asking the British Secretary of State to raise the age limit for Indians to take the civil services exam. 3. Result. In 1885, a public service commission recommended raising the maximum age limit, which was a small victory for Banerjee and his cause. Second National Conference, 1885. Clash of dates. The Second National Conference of the Indian Association was held in Kolkata between December 25 to 27, 1885. 2. Indian National Congress, INC, is formed. At the same time, the first session of the Indian National Congress, INC, was being held in Bombay, now Mumbai. 3. No coordination. These two important events were not planned together, so Banerjee could not attend the Bombay Congress. 4. Similar issues. The topics discussed at the Bombay Congress were very similar to those discussed at the First National Conference in 1883. In fact, Justice K.T. Telang, who was part of the Bombay Congress, even asked Banerjee for notes from the First National Conference. Banerjee's involvement with Congress. 1. Regular attendance. From 1886 to 1917, Banerjee attended every annual session of the Indian National Congress, except the one in Karachi in 1913. 2. Leadership. Banerjee was chosen to lead the Congress twice, once in Pune, 1895, and again in Ahmedabad, 1902. Simplified example. Imagine a group come together to discuss how to improve their school, like adding new clubs, separating teachers from school management decisions, and giving students more opportunities for jobs. They meet every year to talk about these issues. Then a bigger student group, like a National Student Council, is formed, and it talks about the same ideas that the first group had already discussed. One of the key leaders of the first group continues to attend and lead the meetings of the bigger group, making sure the same issues are addressed. In this story, Banerjee is the student who starts the first group, and later he becomes a key figure in the bigger national group, Indian National Congress. Does that help explain it? Would you like to know more about any part? Let me explain this in the simplest way possible. Trip to England, 1890. 1. Congress delegation. In 1890, Surendranath Banerjee was part of a group of 9 people from the Indian National Congress who went to England. They went to talk about changes they wanted in how India was governed. 2. Self-funded. Each person in the group had to pay for their own trip and expenses. 3. Banerjee's role. Among the group, Banerjee stood out as the main speaker. He gave several talks about the political changes Congress wanted for India. His speeches impressed the British people. Oxford Union Debate 1890, 18 debate topic. On May 22, 1890, Banerjee participated in a debate at the Oxford Union. The topic was about a bill in the British Parliament that didn't include an elective principle, which means letting people vote for their representatives. 2. Challenging situation. Oxford was known for its conservative politics, so people thought the motion allowing voting would be defeated. 3. Victory. Banerjee debated against Lord Hugh Cecil and did so well that the majority voted in favor of the motion, supporting voting rights. 4. Result. This led to a small victory for India, the Indian Councils Act of 1892, which included an indirect form of elections, where Indians could choose some of their representatives, though not directly. Banerjee's oratory skills. 1. Eloquent speaker. Banerjee was an excellent speaker, so much so that people called him the trumpet orator because his voice and speeches were loud and powerful. 2. Love for India. He believed that being a good speaker was not enough. He said, anyone who doesn't love their country shouldn't try to become an orator. Role in Bengal Partition Movement, 1905 to 1911. 1. Bengal Partition. The British government decided to divide Bengal in 1905, which upset many people. 2. Banerjee's role. He took a leading role in the movement to stop this partition. However, he did not support violent actions or boycotting British goods. Other contributions. 1. Local self-government. Banerjee supported local self-government, meaning he wanted Indians to have more control over governing themselves. 2. Ripon College. He founded a college called Ripon College, which is now known as Surendranath College. 3. Legislative Assembly. In 1921, Banerjee became a member of the Imperial Legislative Assembly, where laws were made for India. 4. Knighted. That same year, he was knighted, given the title Sir, by the British for his contributions. Simplified example. Imagine a student from your school goes to another country to argue for more student rights, like being able to vote for class leaders. He speaks so well that even though many people thought he would lose, he wins the argument, and the school decides to let students vote in some way. Back at school, he helps lead efforts to stop bad changes that would hurt students, but doesn't support violence. He also opens a new school for more students, and later becomes part of the school's top decision-making group. Finally, he is given a special award for his hard work. Does that help explain it? Would you like to dive deeper into any part? Let me explain this piece about Lord Lytton to you, step by step, in the simplest way possible. 1. Who was Lord Lytton? Lord Lytton was a British man. He was chosen to be the Viceroy of India, the British ruler of India. This happened during the time of the Conservative government, led by Benjamin Disraeli. 2. Why was he chosen? There was a big problem in Central Asia. Britain was worried about the Russian Empire getting stronger in Central Asia. Disraeli thought that a statesman, a wise, important political leader, should handle this issue. He believed Lord Lytton was the right person for this job. Hammer 3. What did Disraeli say to Lord Lytton? Disraeli sent Lytton a letter. He told Lytton that the situation in Central Asia was very serious. He said Lytton had a chance to become famous by solving the problem. In short, he was telling Lytton, this is a very important job, and if you do well, people will remember you forever. 4. Why did Lytton accept the job? Lytton had said no before to a job in Madras, a city in India. He didn't want to go because he wasn't feeling well. But this time, Lytton thought the job as viceroy was too important to refuse. He thought it would be his duty to accept such a big and important role. 5. When did Lytton become the viceroy? Lytton took over the job in April 1876. He replaced the previous viceroy, Lord Northbrook. He started his work in Calcutta, which was the capital of British India at the time. Number 6. What was Lytton's background? Lytton was a diplomat, which means he worked in the field of foreign relations for Britain. He worked in the British Foreign Office in many different jobs. But he did not have experience running a country or knowing about India. 7. What else was Lytton known for? Lytton was not just a politician. He was also a poet, a novelist, and an essayist, someone who writes essays. In the world of books and writing, he was known by a different name, Owen Meredith. 8. Did Lytton know much about India? Before becoming the viceroy, Lytton had no experience with India. He did not know much about Indian affairs or administration. Examples to understand better. Example 1. Imagine you have never played soccer before, but your friend asks you to be the coach of a soccer team. Just like you might not know the rules of the game, Lytton didn't know much about India when he became the leader. Example 2. Think of being asked to solve a problem in a place you've never been to before. You would need to learn a lot very quickly. This is similar to what Lytton had to do in India. Additional info to make it clear. Lord Lytton was part of a bigger British strategy called the Great Game. This was a rivalry between Britain and Russia for control in Central Asia. Britain didn't want Russia to get close to India, so they sent Lytton to help protect British interests in India and Central Asia.
1. Financial reforms. What is financial devolution? Imagine a teacher in a school who does all the work alone, teaches, plans, and even buys supplies. Now, what if the teacher decides to share these jobs with other staff members so that everyone works together? This sharing of responsibilities is like financial devolution. Before this reform, the central government, like the teacher, controlled all the money and spending in India. But Lord Mayo, a previous viceroy, started sharing these money matters with smaller governments in different parts of India, called provincial governments. What was the reform? Lord Lytton continued this idea of sharing the money jobs. He gave the provincial governments, smaller local governments, control over spending in their areas. This included spending money on land revenue, taxes from land, excise, taxes on things like alcohol, stamps, taxes on official documents, law and justice, money for courts and police, general administration, money to run the government. How did the provinces get money? The provincial governments were not given extra money from the central government, but they were allowed to collect money from specific taxes in their own areas. For example, they could collect excise tax from alcohol or other goods, license fees, money from giving people permission to do things like starting a shop. What happened if there was extra money or not enough money? If a provincial government collected more money than expected, they had to share half of the extra money with the central government. If the provincial government didn't collect enough money, meaning there was a deficit, the central government would help pay half of the missing amount. What was the idea behind this system? The government wanted each province to try hard to make more money by improving their local businesses and taxes. If the provinces collected more money, the whole country's financial situation would improve. Example to make it clear. Imagine you run a lemonade stand. You have a friend who gives you lemons, the central government. Now, instead of just selling the lemonade and giving all the money to your friend says, you can keep the money you make from selling lemonade, but if you earn more than we expected, you give me half of the extra. If you don't earn enough, I'll help you cover some of your losses. This way, you're encouraged to work harder to sell more lemonade because it helps both you and your friend. What else happened in the financial reforms? Sir John Strachey, a British official, tried to fix the salt tax problem. Salt was taxed at different rates in different provinces. Some provinces had higher taxes on salt, and some had lower taxes. This made it confusing, and some people tried to smuggle salt from one place to another to avoid taxes. Sir John worked to make the salt tax the same everywhere so that smuggling would stop and the government could earn more money. He also made a deal with the Indian princes, local rulers, to stop making salt in their areas. The government paid them for this, and in return, the government took control of salt production. Point 2. The famine of 1876-78. What is a famine? A famine happens when there isn't enough food for people to eat, often because of bad weather or drought. During a famine, people can't grow crops, and many die from hunger. What happened in the 1876-78 famine? From 1876 to 1878, a terrible famine hit parts of India. The areas worst affected were Madras, now Tamil Nadu, Bombay, now Mumbai, Mysore, Hyderabad, some parts of central India, and Punjab. How bad was the famine? The famine covered 257,000 square miles, which is a huge area. About 58 million people were affected. Many villages were abandoned because people couldn't survive there. People could not grow crops, and large areas of land were left empty. Romesh Dutt, a famous writer, said that 5 million people, 5 million, died in just 1 year because of the famine. Did the government help? The British government tried to help, but their efforts were not good enough. Their famine relief, help for the starving people, didn't work well because their system was weak and slow. What did the government do after the famine? In 1878, the government created a famine commission, a group to study what went wrong and how to fix it. This commission was led by Richard Strachey, and it looked at how to improve famine relief. What were the commission's recommendations? No free help. The commission didn't like the idea of giving out free food. They said that only the very poor people, those who couldn't work, should get free help, work for wages. They said that able-bodied people, people who can work, should be given jobs. The government should pay them enough money to keep them healthy. Famine fund. They recommended that each province should create a famine fund, a savings account with money set aside in case of future famines, railways and irrigation. The commission said that the government should build more railways and irrigation systems to bring water to farms so that future famines could be prevented. Example to understand famine relief. Imagine a town runs out of food. The mayor decides to give free meals only to the sick and elderly who can't work. For everyone else, the mayor offers jobs, like fixing roads or building a new well. The workers are paid enough to buy food. The mayor also starts saving some money in case there's another food shortage in the future. Summary: financial reforms. The provincial governments were given more control over spending, but they had to share extra money with the central government and get help if they didn't have enough. Taxes like the salt tax were made the same everywhere, which stopped smuggling. Famine of 1876-78. A terrible famine affected many parts of India, killing millions of people. The government's relief efforts were weak, but they later formed a commission to improve how they would handle future famines. This included creating jobs, building railways, and setting aside money for famine relief. Additional information: preventing famines. By building railways, the government hoped that food could be moved quickly to areas suffering from famine. Irrigation projects would help farmers grow crops, even during dry seasons, making it easier to avoid future famines.
All right, let's break it down step by step, word by word, in the simplest way possible. What was the Royal Titles Act of 1876? Act means a law. The Royal Titles Act was a law passed by the British Parliament in 1876. This law gave Queen Victoria a new title, Kaiser-i-Hind, which means Queen Empress of India. Why was this title important? Queen Victoria was already the Queen of Britain, but now this title made her officially the ruler of India too. She was given more power over India. What happened after the law? After this law was passed, a big event called a Darbar was organized in India to announce this new title. A Darbar is like a grand ceremony with lots of people, decorations, and celebrations. This Darbar was held in Delhi on January 1st, 1877. What was the problem with the Darbar? Even though the British government in India spent millions of rupees on the grand ceremony, the country was facing a terrible famine at the same time. Famine means there wasn't enough food, and many people were dying of hunger. What was the reaction? People were angry because the British government was spending so much money on the celebration, while many people in India were suffering and starving. R.G. Pran, a writer, said that this event made Indians feel humiliated, ashamed, because they were not treated with care or respect. An example of this anger: a journal, a kind of magazine, from Calcutta said the British government was like Nero. Nero was a Roman emperor who, according to stories, played music while Rome burned down. This means that the British government was celebrating while people in India were suffering. How did it affect Indians? Even though the Darbar made Indian rulers seem like feudatories, meaning they had less power and were controlled by Britain, it made educated Indians think about their own rights. It was like they realized, wait, we are citizens of this empire, and we deserve better treatment. An example of the change: Lala Lajpat Rai, a famous leader, said this event made Indians feel that they should have a rightful place in the British Empire. They started saying things like India for Indians, meaning that they wanted India to be ruled by Indians, not by the British. What happened after the Darbar? A famous Indian leader, S.N. Banerjee, started thinking about creating a group or association where Indians could voice their grievances, talk about their problems, and fight for their rights. This Darbar was a turning point where educated Indians started to organize themselves and demand fair treatment from the British government. Simplified recap with examples. Imagine you're in a village and there's a terrible drought. People have no food and many are dying. Suddenly, the richest person in the village throws a huge party with lots of decorations, food, and celebrations. But instead of helping the hungry people, they spend all their money on the party. You'd feel angry, right? This is what happened in 1877. The British threw a grand celebration, but people in India were starving. This made Indians feel disrespected. However, it also made them realize that they should start fighting for their rights. Leaders like S.N. Banerjee and Lala Lajpat Rai started speaking up, and the idea of India for Indians began to spread. So, while the event itself was painful for many Indians, it also planted the seeds for the freedom movement, where Indians started asking for their rights and self-rule. Does that make sense? Let me know if you want me to break down any part even further.
The Vernacular Press Act of 1878. Vernacular means local languages. These are the languages spoken by people in their everyday lives, like Hindi, Bengali, Tamil, and Urdu. The press refers to newspapers and magazines. These are publications that tell people what's happening in the country. Act means a law that is made by the government. So, the Vernacular Press Act was a law made in 1878 to control newspapers written in Indian languages. Why did the British government make this law? At that time, India was under British rule, and the British government was doing a lot of things that made Indian people angry. Lord Lytton, the British viceroy, did not help people during the famines, times when there was not enough food and people were dying. Taxes were still collected, even though people were suffering and didn't have enough to eat. In some parts of India, especially in Bombay, people were so angry they started riots, violent protests, and even robbed moneylenders, people who gave out loans but charged high interest. Because of all these bad things happening, people started writing about it in the vernacular newspapers. These were newspapers written in Indian languages. The newspapers were talking about how the British government was not helping people. What was the British government worried about? The British were worried because more and more people were reading these newspapers and realizing that the government wasn't treating them well. The newspapers were telling the truth, but the government didn't want people to think badly about them, so Lord Lytton decided to stop these newspapers from spreading this information. He thought if people couldn't read about these problems, they would stop being angry. What did the Vernacular Press Act say? This law gave magistrates, British government officials, a lot of power over Indian newspapers. The magistrate could tell the printer or publisher of a newspaper to sign a bond, a promise, that they wouldn't publish anything that could make people angry with the British government, create hate between people of different races, religions, or castes. If the newspaper broke this rule, the magistrate could take money as a form of security. This is like a fine. Seize, take away, the printing machines, so the newspaper couldn't print anything anymore. No appeal was allowed. This means that if a magistrate did something unfair, the newspaper couldn't go to court to complain. However, there was a way for newspapers to avoid this law. They could show their drafts, rough copies, to a government censor before printing. A censor is someone who checks if the newspaper is saying anything bad about the government. Why was this law unfair? This law treated the Indian language newspapers, vernacular press, very differently from the English language newspapers. The British government called the Indian language newspapers the disloyal native press because they were writing things that made the government look bad. The English language newspapers, on the other hand, were called the loyal Anglo-Indian press because they supported the government. This was unfair because it only punished the Indian language newspapers, even though the people had the right to talk about their problems. What did people say about this law? Sir Erskine Perry, a British official, said that this law was a bad idea for India. He called it a retrograde measure, meaning it would push India backwards. He also said that this law was a very strong weapon to destroy the free press. Example: imagine you have a right to speak your mind, and suddenly someone comes and says you can't talk freely anymore. This would feel unfair, right? That's what the press felt like. In Banerjee, an Indian leader, said the law felt like a bolt from the blue, meaning it was a big shock and came as a surprise. People didn't expect the government to act this way so quickly. What was the worst part of the law? The law created a big division between the disloyal native press and the loyal Anglo-Indian press. The disloyal native press was made up of Indian language newspapers that criticized the British government. They were punished under this law. The loyal Anglo-Indian press was made up of English language newspapers that supported the government. They were not affected by this LAWSO. The British were saying, if you're Indian and speak out against us, you'll be punished. But if you're English and say nice things, you're safe. What was the nickname for this law? People started calling this law the Gagging Act. Gagging means to silence someone. So, this law was silencing the Indian language newspapers and making it harder for people to speak out. Did the law work? This law scared the vernacular, Indian language, newspapers. Some of them stopped writing about the government because they didn't want to get in trouble, but it didn't stop the anger of the people. It only made people hide their anger. Example: imagine you're angry at someone, but instead of shouting, you start whispering about it. You're still angry, but now you're just keeping it quiet. An example to make it easier: imagine there's a school where the students are very unhappy because the principal doesn't care about them. Some students start writing letters that talk about how bad the principal is. These letters get popular, and many students start reading them. The principal gets worried because more and more students are agreeing with the letters. So, the principal makes a rule. Anyone who wants to write a letter must first show it to the principal. If the letter says anything bad about the school or principal, it won't be allowed to be printed. If someone prints a letter without permission, the principal can take away their printing machine or punish them. Now, the students are angry because they can't speak freely anymore. They stop writing openly but start whispering their complaints to each other. The problem doesn't go away. It just goes underground. Summary: in 1878, the British government made a law called the Vernacular Press Act. This law was made to control newspapers written in Indian languages. It gave magistrates, British officers, the power to punish any newspaper that criticized the government. This law was unfair because it only affected Indian language newspapers, not English ones. The law made some newspapers quiet, but it didn't stop people from being angry. The anger just went underground. If you still have any questions or want more details, feel free to ask.
Let's break this down in the simplest way possible, step by step, like you're learning it for the first time. The Arms Act of 1878. 1. Arms means weapons like guns, swords, or knives. 2. An act is a law made by the government. 3. The Arms Act of 1878 was a law that said Indians could not own or carry weapons without permission. What did the law say? This law made it a crime for anyone to have weapons like guns or swords without a special license, official permission. If someone wanted to keep a weapon, they had to get permission from the government. If a person broke this law and didn't have a license, they could be punished. What were the punishments? 1. If you had a weapon without permission, you could go to jail for up to 3 years, or you could be asked to pay a fine, money as a punishment. Sometimes you could face both jail and a fine. 2. If you tried to hide the weapon or didn't tell the government about it, the punishment was even more serious. You could go to jail for 7 years or pay a fine, or both. Why did they make this law? The British government in India was worried that Indians might rebel or fight against them. By making it hard for Indians to have weapons, the British thought they could control the people more easily. What was the worst part of this law? The law was very unfair because it was different for different people. 1. Indians needed permission to keep weapons. 2. But Europeans, Anglo-Indians, and some British government officials didn't need this permission. They could keep weapons freely. This was called racial discrimination because one group, Indians, was treated differently than another group, Europeans or Anglo-Indians. What is racial discrimination? Racial discrimination means treating people unfairly just because they belong to a different race or group. In this case, Indians were not trusted by the British to have weapons, but Europeans and Anglo-Indians were allowed to keep them. Why was this unfair? Imagine if there was a school where the principal made a rule that only some students could play sports, but others couldn't, just because of where they were born or how they looked. This would feel wrong, right? Everyone should be treated the same. Similarly, the Arms Act treated Indians unfairly and showed that the British government didn't trust Indians to own weapons. What was the impact of this law? 1. This law made it clear that the British didn't trust Indians anymore. 2. It created a sense of anger and injustice among the Indian people. They felt that they were being treated like they couldn't be trusted or respected. 3. It was one more step by the British to keep control over India by making sure only the British or their allies had weapons. An example to understand this better. Imagine if there's a community where only some people are allowed to have tools like hammers and saws, while others are not allowed. The ones who don't have tools feel helpless because they can't build or protect themselves. The ones who do have the tools have all the power and can do whatever they want. This is what happened with the Arms Act. The British wanted to keep control over India by making sure Indians didn't have weapons. That way, they wouldn't be able to fight back or protect themselves.
Background. Why is this important? Civil service means jobs where people work for the government to help run the country. In the 1800s, India was ruled by the British. Most of the high government jobs were held by British people, not Indians. Many Indians wanted to work in the government, but it was very difficult because of unfair rules made by the British. What did the Charter Act of 1833 say? This law said that anyone, Indian or British, could get a government job if they were qualified. In simple terms, the government jobs were supposed to be open to everyone, no matter what their race, Indian or British. What did the Charter Act of 1853 do? It said that people who wanted high jobs in the civil service had to pass an exam. But here's the problem. The exam was held only in London, which is far away in England. This made it very hard for Indians to take the exam, travel all the way to London, and get the jobs. Who was the first Indian to get the job? In 1864, a man named Satyendranath Tagore became the first Indian to pass this exam and join the Covenanted Civil Service, the group of high-level government jobs. It was a big moment because it showed that if Indians were given a fair chance, they could do well. The Act of 1870. A law to hire more Indians. This law said that one-fifth of the people getting high jobs in the Covenanted Civil Service should be Indians. But it didn't say that Indians had to take the exam. The law said that Indians could be hired without an exam. Still, it took the government 10 years to make rules on how this would actually work, so it wasn't done immediately. Problems for Indians. Even though some laws were made to help Indians, it was still very difficult for them to get these high jobs. Let's look at why. Between 1862 and 1875, only 40 Indians took the civil service exam in London, and only 10 of them passed. British officials in India didn't want Indians in these top government jobs. They wanted to block Indians from getting these jobs by making the process difficult. Lord Lytton's role. Lord Lytton was the Viceroy of India, the top British official in India at that time. He admitted that the British government wasn't following the law properly. They were trying to avoid letting Indians get high jobs. They made it hard for Indians instead of just banning them completely. This was like saying, "We don't want you, but we can't say it directly, so we'll just make it impossible for you to qualify." Lytton's plan. Creating a separate service for Indians. Lord Lytton had an idea. Instead of letting Indians into the top jobs, the Covenanted Civil Service, he wanted to create a new, separate service for Indians called the Statutory Civil Service. What's the difference? The Covenanted Civil Service had the highest jobs with good pay and high status. The Statutory Civil Service was a lower-level service, meaning less pay and lower status. So, even though Indians could join the Statutory Civil Service, they wouldn't have the same respect or pay as the British in the Covenanted Civil Service. How did the Statutory Civil Service work? In 1879, the Statutory Civil Service was created. The Indian government could hire some Indians for this service, but only if they came from good families and had social status. The number of Indians in this service couldn't be more than 1/6, January 6th, of the total people hired for the Covenanted Civil Service in a year. This means that for every 6 British people hired, only 1 Indian could be hired. Why didn't Indians like it? Indians didn't want to be part of a separate, lower status service. They wanted equal opportunities and didn't want to be treated as less important. This is why the Statutory Civil Service wasn't very popular among Indians. Not many Indians wanted to join. What happened to the Covenanted Civil Service? Even though Lord Lytton wanted to completely close the Covenanted Civil Service to Indians, the British government didn't agree to that. Instead, they made it even harder for Indians to join by lowering the maximum age for the exam from 21 to 19 years, keeping the exam only in London, so young Indians had to travel far to take it, which was expensive and difficult. Why was this unfair? Think about it like this. Imagine you are in a school, and there is an exam for a prize. But only some students are allowed to take the exam easily, while others are given extra rules and difficult conditions. That's what happened to Indians trying to get into the civil service. The age limit was reduced so fewer Indians could even qualify to take the exam. The exam was held only in London, which was far away, making it hard for most Indians to afford to go there. Even if Indians wanted to join the service, they were given less respect and lower pay through the Statutory Civil Service. How did Indians react? Indians were very angry about these unfair rules. S.N. Banerjee, a famous Indian leader, said this was a deliberate attempt to stop Indians from getting into the civil service. Indians felt that they were being treated as second-class citizens in their own country. Summary: the statutory civil service was created in 1879 to allow some Indians to get lower-level government jobs. However, this service didn't have the same status or pay as the covenanted civil service, which was reserved mostly for the British. Even though the British government passed laws to let Indians work in the government, they made it very hard for Indians to actually get the jobs. Indians were upset about being treated unfairly and felt like the British were blocking their progress.
All right, let's break down everything about Lord Lytton and the Second Afghan War into the simplest, easiest way. I'll explain it step by step, like I'm teaching a young child who has never heard about it before. Who was Lord Lytton? Lord Lytton was a British viceroy in India. This means he was the person the British government put in charge of ruling India when India was under British control. The Second Afghan War. Now, let's talk about the Second Afghan War. 1. Afghanistan is a country that is northwest of India. The British were ruling India and were always afraid that other countries, like Russia, might invade India through Afghanistan. 2. So Lord Lytton wanted to create a scientific frontier. This means he wanted a safe, well-protected border in the northwest so that no one could invade India through Afghanistan. 3. To do this, he started a war with Afghanistan in 1878. He thought this war would help protect India, but it was a bad idea. Why was the war a bad idea? The war turned out to be useless and did not achieve what Lytton had planned. It was like starting a fight that didn't help anyone. The war also cost a lot of money, and that money came from taxes. The poor farmers, called ryots in India, had to pay these taxes. So the war ended up hurting the poor people. Lord Lytton's ideas. Even though the war was a failure, Lord Lytton had some other ideas that were important. 1. He wanted to create a new region called the Northwest Frontier Province. This area would be under the control of the central British government. He didn't complete this idea, but another viceroy, Lord Curzon, later made it happen. 2. Lytton also had an idea to create a group of Indian princes who could give advice to the British government. This group later became the Chamber of Princes in 1921. 3. He wanted to put India's money system on something called the gold standard. This is a complicated money idea where money is based on how much gold a country has. 4. Lytton created a famine commission in 1878. This was a group of people who studied how to deal with famines, times when there's no food, in India. Their ideas helped the government make better rules for future famines. Was Lord Lytton a good or bad ruler? Most people think that Lord Lytton was a bad ruler. Let's understand why. 1. H.C.E. Zacharias, who studied history, said that Lord Lytton and another viceroy named Lord Curzon did a lot of harm to both India and to Britain's rule in India. Number 2. In the British Parliament, a politician named the Marquess of Hartington said that Lord Lytton was the complete opposite of what a good viceroy should be. Why was he unpopular? Lytton's policies, the rules and ideas he made, were unpopular and made people unhappy. His way of ruling was very strict and repressive, which means he controlled people in harsh ways. Because of this, there was a lot of unrest. People were angry and frustrated in India. The people didn't trust the British rulers. Almost like a revolution. A writer named Blunt said that by the time Lytton's rule ended, things in India were almost at the point of revolution. This means that people were so angry, they were close to starting a big fight to change the way things were. Lytton's rule, a blessing in disguise? Now, here's an interesting idea. 1. Philip Woodruff, a historian, said that bad rulers can sometimes be good in the long run. Why? Because they make people so angry that they start fighting for change. 2. In this way, Lytton's bad rule might have been a blessing in disguise. Even though he didn't intend it, his harsh policies made Indians unite and start fighting for freedom. Summary. Lord Lytton was the British viceroy who ruled India during the Second Afghan War. He started the war to protect India from invasions, but it was a failure and wasted a lot of money. His other ideas, like forming a northwest frontier province and a group of Indian princes, Chamber of Princes, were later carried out by other people. Most people think Lytton was a bad ruler because he treated the Indian people harshly and didn't understand their problems. However, his harsh policies made Indians unite and start fighting for so in a strange way, his bad rule helped create the political movement that would lead to India's independence.